In the ancient world, a powerful force was beginning to stir, a people not yet recognized as a nation, and without a single ruler to command their forces. For now, they would continue to call upon their pagan gods, seeking strength and prosperity. But soon, their voices would echo in distant lands, where others would come to fear, admire, love, and even hate them. These were the Vikings, a name that would become synonymous with both terror and awe. Their steadfast determination was reflected in their craftsmanship, as their axes shaped the ships that would carry their people across Europe, into Asia, and even to lands yet unknown beyond the western horizon. Tales of their voyages would be told and retold for centuries, their sagas sending messages across millennia. When people saw their ships approaching, they would either be deeply impressed or utterly terrified. The dragon had come for its prey, and its wings would fly in the wind, carrying men across oceans. The Vikings' reach extended far, possibly even as far as New York, Florida, and maybe into Mexico. However, the Vikings have often been cast in a negative light in European history, largely because of their tendency to attack monasteries and other centers of literacy. These actions didn't earn them a favorable reputation, as their names became forever etched into the history of places both near and far. Death and destruction followed in the wake of some Viking expeditions. In a dark vault in Copenhagen, the remains of about 450 Norse Vikings from Greenland lie in silent testimony to a violent past. At one of the earliest churchyards in Norse Greenland, a mass grave holds 13 dismembered individuals, their bones jumbled together with skulls neatly arranged along one edge of the grave. Several of the skulls bear the telltale signs of violent deaths, cut marks from swords or axes. But perhaps these violent ends distract us from the larger and more truthful story of a culture that rose above others and reigned for half a millennium. Once, this land was worked by men in distant Greenland, men whose remains, along with those of women and children, now add a chapter to an astonishing story of survival and heroism. Every bone is like a page from a book, offering scientists insight into daily life 1,000 years ago. When we examine the skeletons, we can see that, at least at the beginning of the settlement period, nutrition was adequate. There are no overt signs of malnutrition. But the Viking story doesn't begin in Greenland. It starts in Scandinavia, around the year 750 AD, in one of the many small farms and villages scattered along the coasts and waterways. Despite the popular image of the Vikings as blonde Scandinavians, the term Viking is not an ethnic label, nor does it indicate any national identity. There were Slavic Vikings, Irish Vikings, and more. To go, a Viking was an activity carried out by a diverse group of people living in northern Europe at that time. Arab emissaries who traveled to the north were both surprised and frightened by what they encountered. Ibn Fadlan, writing in 922, described them as the filthiest of God's creatures. He was appalled by their daily practice of washing their faces and heads in what he considered the dirtiest way possible. Yet, he was also surprised to note that they combed their hair every day, a sign of their concern for appearance despite their otherwise fearsome demeanor. The Viking connection to the sea was deep and ancient, rooted in the thousands of miles of coastline that shaped their way of life. Long before the Viking Age, seafaring was a crucial part of their cultural heritage. The rich fisheries along the Atlantic coast supported important settlements, and farms in the area were self-sufficient and prosperous, with extended families living together in large dwellings. Arab emissaries who traveled to the north were both surprised and frightened by what they encountered. Ibn Fadlan, writing in 922, described them as the filthiest of God's creatures. He was appalled by their daily practice of washing their faces and heads in what he considered the dirtiest way possible. Yet, he was also surprised to note that they combed their hair every day, a sign of their concern for appearance despite their otherwise fearsome demeanor. The Viking connection to the sea was deep and ancient, rooted in the thousands of miles of coastline that shaped their way of life. Long before the Viking Age, seafaring was a crucial part of their cultural heritage. The rich fisheries along the Atlantic coast supported important settlements, and farms in the area were self-sufficient and prosperous, with extended families living together in large dwellings. Vikings were proud of their beauty and status, which they expressed through gold, silver, glass, and textiles, as well as an original art. But more than anything, they were farmers, peacefully tilling the land and clearing forests for agriculture. On most large farms, there was a boatyard where over a few months, a new boat would take shape. These boats were based on a tradition of shipbuilding that went back hundreds of years. Viking craftsmen developed ships that would forever change the course of history. In the houses, women would use standing looms to weave the dragon's wings, the mighty sails that gave Viking ships their extraordinary power. The Vikings were proud of their ships, and artists made sure that the impression they left on others was unforgettable. But were they truthful, or did they allow for artistic freedom in depicting these ships? Modern boat builders and maritime archaeologists have long been puzzled by the depicted rigs of Viking ships. History has offered little help in trying to reconstruct these boats and make them seaworthy. Many Viking ship finds have been made in very shallow waters or along the coastline, where local people had often salvaged all the valuable parts, leaving behind only scattered planks and pieces of rigging. By carefully piecing together these remains, Ole Kvalheim and his colleagues have drawn the conclusion that the Viking ship fleet was surprisingly diverse. The bulky cargo ship known as a nar had a 950-square-foot sail and became the workhorse of Viking trading routes. There were smaller ships used for fishing, ferrying, and short local travel. And then there was the longboat, powered by sail and oars, the warship dragon of the sagas, built to strike fear into the hearts of enemies. Max Vinner and Erik Andersen, Danish scientists, were fortunate to find several sunken Viking ships, including 5 from Skoldeland. These 5 ships, from the late Viking Age in the 11th century, represent different types of vessels from different origins: 1 ship from Ireland, 2 from Western Norway, and 2 from Denmark. It was left to these scientists to figure out how the ships were sailed. They examined every hole in detail to understand their functions, knowing that the wear and tear around certain holes indicated the former direction of ropes and rigging. In a way, you have to be a sailor yourself to understand all the clues you find in the remains. The Vikings didn't search for answers in books. They left their mark on the world in a way that continues to fascinate and inspire us today. The Vikings were famous for their incredible skills at sea. They used a single square sail on their ships, a design that had been around in northern Norway for more than 1,000 years. This same type of sail was still in use in the early 1900s, particularly in the Lofoten fishery, where these boats were often called little Viking ships. In their efforts to understand how the Vikings sailed, 2 researchers named Erik and Max made a significant discovery. They found a hole in a boat that showed how it was used as part of the system for holding the sails. This discovery was like finding the missing piece of a puzzle, helping them to accurately recreate the sails used by the Vikings. This allowed them to bring back an ancient sailing tradition that had once ruled the northern seas. One of the most important things the Vikings did was to add a sail to a boat design that had been in use for centuries. This innovation was a game changer, allowing the Vikings to travel far and wide for trading and exploring. Their largest ships could carry heavy loads, up to 40 tons, which included goods, animals, and people. Despite their size, these ships were designed to navigate in shallow waters because they only needed 5 feet of depth to float. This is similar to modern boats that are built for both deep and shallow waters, allowing for flexibility in different environments. One example of a shallow harbor used by the Vikings was in northern Germany, where the now vanished town of Hedeby once existed. Hedeby became a major trading center, with a unique layout that allowed many people to live and work in a small area. Farmers in the region began to trade more, shifting from a rural way of life to a more urban one. By controlling important trade routes and using strategic warfare, the Vikings quickly became powerful. This could be compared to how modern cities grow and gain influence by controlling key industries and trade networks. The Vikings traded valuable goods like amber, fossilized tree resin, eider down, soft feathers from eider ducks, and high-quality sharpening stones. Because they had access to vast wilderness areas in the north and east, they were able to dominate the fur trade, selling animal skins to kings and rulers of faraway lands. These furs were highly prized, much like luxury items are today. The Vikings also traded for essential items like salt and precious metals. However, their trade also included human lives. Archaeologists have found evidence of slave markets in Hedeby, including iron handcuffs and chains. This dark aspect of their trading activities reminds us of the unethical practices that have existed in various cultures throughout history. Haithabu was a melting pot of different cultures, with boats leaving its shores to travel in all directions. Vikings from what is now Sweden rowed across the Baltic Sea, navigating a complex river system that took them as far as the Caspian and Black Seas. To the people they encountered, these Vikings were known as the Russ. The Russ eventually established rule over a land that still carries their name today, Russia. The design of Viking boats, which allowed them to be pulled over land when necessary, gave them a strategic advantage, much like modern vehicles that can operate in multiple terrains. However, these voyages were dangerous, and many warriors lost their lives far from home. As writing became more common, the deeds and bravery of these Viking warriors were recorded on elaborate runestones. According to historical records, the Slavs, Chuds, Kriviches, and Visions invited the Rus to rule over them, leading to the creation of a vast territory with Kiev as its capital. While the Vikings frequently sailed to Constantinople, they were unsuccessful in their attempts to conquer the Byzantine Empire. Despite this, their strength and bravery earned them respect, and the Byzantine Emperor even hired them as his personal mercenary guards. This is similar to how skilled soldiers are often recruited by powerful leaders to serve as elite forces today. The Vikings were not only skilled merchants but also elite warriors. Their military power allowed them to demand tributes in furs and slaves from their Slavic subjects, which they then traded with the Arabs in exchange for silver. The expansion of Viking influence, both to the east and the west, was heavily dependent on the development and improvement of their ships. At the Viking Ship Museum in Denmark, a man named Soren Nielsen oversees the construction of replica Viking ships. He emphasizes the importance of following the natural grain of the wood when building boats, a practice that ensures the wood retains its strength. This is similar to modern craftsmanship, where understanding the materials used is crucial for creating durable products. During Viking times, there was a whole industry built around this skill, with boat builders selecting naturally curved branches to match the shapes needed for the ship's hulls. Oak was the preferred wood, though in the northern parts of Scandinavia, builders sometimes had to use pine because it was more readily available. The tradition of Viking shipbuilding is still alive today, with a small team of craftsmen at the Viking Ship Museum continuing the work. They have built the longest replica ship ever, which is 100 feet long. Despite its slender form, this ship challenges conventional boat building rules. The Viking method of construction, known as clinker construction, involves overlapping planks, which gives the ship remarkable flexibility and strength. This technique has been passed down for over 1,000 years and allows the ship to move gracefully through the water, bending and flexing like a living creature rather than crashing into the waves like a stiff object. This is the secret behind the success of Viking ships. Modern shipbuilders have tested these ancient designs at the Danish Maritime Institute. A naval architect named Kim Henriksen has shown that the clinker construction method is superior in many ways. Viking ships, much like today's fastest ocean racers, were designed to skim across the water with minimal resistance. This is similar to how modern boats use air bubbles under the hull to reduce drag and increase speed.
John Amorel Edgerton, who built and sails his own Viking ship, notes that these vessels were designed to surf on the waves, reaching impressive speeds of 15, 18, or even 20 knots, comparable to the fastest modern sailing boats. However, speed alone wasn't enough to make the Vikings so dominant on the seas. They also possessed exceptional navigational skills, allowing them to control the oceans for nearly 500 years. Initially, they stayed close to the coasts, where navigation was easier. But as they ventured further into the open sea, they had to develop new methods of finding their way. Soren Thursland, a retired Danish sea captain, believes that the Vikings had a deep understanding of navigation. During an excavation in Greenland, a small wooden piece was found that might have been used as a sun compass. This tool would have helped Viking captains determine direction based on the sun's shadow. When this theory was tested by experts, it was confirmed that the lines carved into the wood were deliberate and had a specific purpose. The sun compass, when used correctly, would have allowed Viking captains to maintain an accurate east-west course even in the open sea. Further evidence from a book called Rim, written in the late Viking period, shows that the Vikings had an advanced understanding of astronomical navigation. They knew that the Earth was round, used the moon and tidal currents to calculate time, and relied on the polar star to navigate. They even created distance charts for European sailing routes, with their estimates being remarkably close, only 2 to 4% off, compared to modern satellite navigation. This is similar to how today's sailors use a combination of tools and technology to navigate the seas accurately. The information found in Rim suggests that Viking culture was not isolated. Instead, it absorbed knowledge from various sources, including the Greek geographer Ptolemy and the distant court of the Caliph of Baghdad. The Vikings' ability to combine this knowledge with their maritime expertise allowed them to navigate the world's oceans with unmatched precision. They had knowledge that whales often appeared when nearing Iceland, and that seabirds indicated proximity to land. By following these flying birds, they would reach shore. In the early 8th century, Irish monks seeking exile to serve God drifted to the remote island of Iceland. Their stories likely reached the Vikings in Norway, spurring the first wave of emigration to this new land. These North Atlantic Vikings were known as the Norse. The middle-ranking chieftains, outmaneuvered as Scandinavian kingdoms slowly formed, saw an opportunity to rule by discovering new territories. It's important to distinguish the mindset of these chieftains, who were primarily searching for a place where they could wield power. Most had lost power struggles further east, either in Norway before going to Iceland, or in Iceland before heading to Greenland. For others, following the chieftains, the goal was different. They sought land and a better life, aiming to become more prosperous farmers. They brought with them extended families, slaves, and animals to Iceland, effectively relocating entire farming communities. Many early settlers were of mixed Norse-Celtic heritage, and some scientists suggest that East European Slavs were among the first settlers. At the beginning of the settlement period, Iceland was heavily forested. However, within 50 years, the land was cleared, possibly for timber, but more likely to create grazing land. Anthropologist Tom McGovern at Hunter College in New York studied early Icelandic settlements and observed that the Viking colonizers, upon arriving in these untouched lands, disrupted ecosystems by introducing European insects, livestock, and farming practices. The introduction of familiar European agricultural methods, including raising pigs, cows, sheep, goats, and horses, led to deforestation, loss of grasslands, and increased erosion. Another element of the Viking settlement strategy involved the later arrivals renting animals from the pioneers, who grew richer and more powerful as a result. Latecomers struggled to access fertile land, leading many to consider moving on to new territories. Life in Iceland was tough, existing at the crossroads between old pagan religions and the emerging promises of Christianity. Some resisted giving up heathen traditions, such as eating horse meat, infanticide, and pagan burial practices. Iceland, a remote colony, lacked timber for building houses and ocean-going vessels. A trade agreement with Norway, tied to Norway's demand that Iceland convert to Christianity, became inevitable. However, on Icelandic farms, tales were told of distant lands sighted by brave seafarers, inspiring young Norsemen to dream of different lives. These stories also warned of the dangers of venturing further west. One such story is of Eric the Red, a low-ranking chieftain who fled west after killing a man in Iceland. He was the first to attempt to settle new lands further west. After enduring difficult conditions in the pack ice, his group was rewarded with the sight of a new land. Eric the Red, now the highest-ranking ruler of this new land, promoted his Greenland to followers, sparking an exodus from Iceland, which was then torn by religious and political conflicts. However, the first convoy to sail to Greenland faced significant hardship. Of the 25 ships that left Iceland, only 14 reached Eric the Red settlement. Eric's promise of a Greenland wasn't a lie. 1,000 years ago, the climate was much warmer than it is today. In sheltered fjords, forests grew tall, grazing areas were abundant, and soon about 3,000 people occupied hundreds of new farmsteads along Greenland's southwest coast. If ships reached Greenland's southern tip, they could find shelter away from the pack ice. Today, Danish archaeologists are trying to reconstruct the community that grew there, finding few remains, but uncovering a structure believed to be a Norse boathouse. It's thought that these buildings were used to repair ships before continuing on to further western journeys. For the Vikings, this was a new world, full of surprises. The Inuit and the Norse arrived in Greenland around the same time, the Inuit crossing over from Arctic Canada. The meeting between them was likely a surprise to both groups. While there were stories of hostilities, the encounter was probably friendly. Unlike the Norse, the Inuit already knew how to exploit Arctic resources, such as sealskin ropes, walrus ivory, and seal and polar bear fur. The ivory and rope, in particular, became highly prized trading goods, allowing the Greenland colony to flourish and maintain regular contact with European traders. As Christianity grew stronger, even the pagan chieftain Eric the Red was forced to build a small church for his wife. The Norse, true to their trading nature, also used Christianity as a source of income, renting out their small churches to settlers who needed consecrated earth for burials. A daring young Norseman, Bjarni, once lost his way at sea and drifted in fog to a land he didn't recognize, but he knew it wasn't the Greenland he had heard about. His story of an unnamed land sparked interest among other Norse sailors, including Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson. Currents and wind patterns near Greenland made it easier to reach North America, though the ever-present fog was a challenge. By following the currents, a ship would eventually reach Baffin Island, which Leif Erikson named Helluland, meaning slab land, due to its stony appearance. They continued south, encountering forests that grew taller the further they traveled. Leif named this region Markland, the land of trees. Encouraged by what they saw, they sailed on, spending 2 days at sea with northeasterly winds until they sighted land. They reached an island in fine weather, finding dew on the ground that they drank, believing it to be the sweetest thing they had ever tasted. Archaeologist Birgitta Wallace has traced Leif Erikson's steps, finding the remains of Norse expeditions in North America. She believes that Newfoundland, which the Vikings called Vinland, or the land of wine, reflects the discoveries they made there. At present-day Lanza o Meadows, the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America, she has found evidence that supports the saga's accounts. The stories, though written down 200 years after the events, are verified through archaeology, allowing historians to draw conclusions. The exploration team likely consisted of a strong leader, skilled craftsmen, and a few slaves. The sagas indicate that their trips were exploratory, but if they found the right place, they intended to settle there. Artifacts found at Lanza o Meadows suggest that boats were repaired there, and it's known that the blacksmith was busy making new rivets and attaching new planks to the hull. Close to the boat repair site, archaeologists discovered lumps of corroded iron, revealing old rivets inside through X-ray photography.
One of the most striking finds from the excavations is the analysis of jasper stones used to make fire. Stones from Greenland, Iceland, and North America were compared to those found in Newfoundland. The jasper found in the largest building matched that of Greenland, suggesting it was Leif Erikson's house. Fire strikers found in another house came from Iceland, fitting the saga's description of Eriksson's companions. Butternuts found at the site indicate that the Norse explorers had traveled to the inner parts of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where these nuts and wild grapes were abundant, allowing them to produce the much-desired wine. It's likely that the Norse launched journeys from Newfoundland to other sites, as their ambitious nature would not have been content to stay in such a cold, icy place. Icelandic writer Paul Bertorsson's theories, including his claim that the Norse sailed to present-day New York, have sparked debate, though archaeological evidence hasn't substantiated this. However, others believe that it's possible, considering the resources available in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Sailing along the coasts of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia remains a challenging task, even today. Gunnar Merrill Egertson, who sailed from Iceland to Greenland in North America, believes he understands the mindset of Leif Erikson and his followers. Their thinking was no different from his own. To sail to North America and stop there would have been illogical. Gunnar believes they went as far south as New York or even Florida and Mexico. When Gunnar sailed into New York Harbor, he was convinced the sagas accurately described this as one of the places the Norse explored. Paul Bertorsson shares this view, suggesting that present-day Brooklyn might have been the site of the Norse settlement of Hop. The fish mentioned in the sagas could have been winter flounder. The sagas also recount encounters with Native Americans, whom the Norse referred to as Skraelings. One puzzling incident describes how the Skraelings initially traded peacefully with the Norse but then returned the next day to fight. Today, it's understood that the Native Americans, who were lactose intolerant, likely became ill after drinking the Norse's milk, leading them to believe they had been poisoned. There would be no peaceful coexistence between the Norse and Native Americans. Lacking superior weapons, the Norse knew they were losing the battle. The sagas reveal that the Norse were fearful of the Native Americans and that their attempts to settle in North America were ultimately unsuccessful. Despite the excellent land, they couldn't live there safely, and eventually decided to leave. The failure to establish a settlement may have been doomed from the start. A new colony couldn't be sustained with just a few people. Hundreds were needed, but the Norse didn't have the numbers. Although the sagas mention only 5 trips, it's believed many more ships sailed along these coasts. However, upon returning to Greenland, they faced a new challenge. The climate had worsened, making farming increasingly difficult. For a long time, the climate theory was accepted as the reason for the end of the Greenland settlements. But now, many believe the Norse made too many wrong decisions. Climate change alone didn't destroy the Norse society in Greenland. It was their inability to adapt. They arrived at the beginning of the Little Ice Age, which gradually worsened, leading to increased pack ice and the eventual closure of the northern route from Greenland to Iceland. The western settlement in Greenland lasted only 500 years, disappearing around 1300. By 1450, the Norse society had vanished. Those who believe in the climate theory point to archaeological evidence, such as bones found in an old settlement. Research showed that in the final days of the settlement, the Norse were eating their dogs to survive. It seems the Norse might have refused to adapt to Arctic conditions. Instead of switching from farming to fishing, they continued to focus on raising cattle, a strategy that failed them. Their settlements became increasingly dependent on the ivory trade, but as the market dwindled, their economic basis collapsed. Unlike the Inuit, who adapted by making clothes from animal skins and developing sophisticated hunting tools, the Norse stuck to traditional European methods that didn't work in Greenland's changing environment. The collapse of the Greenland colony was a tragedy, with the Norse finding themselves isolated, lacking both the will and the means to change their ways. The lesson from their story is a powerful one. Adapting to changing circumstances is essential for survival.
Thanks for joining our Viking journey. Subscribe, share, and drop your thoughts. Your feedback keeps these legends alive. You're part of this epic adventure.